I like the surface. I like being able to see sort of like the crayon marks and have it feel like kind of like a drawing that's sort of morphing into a painting, you know. And so it depends on what you want, you know. And once you commit to sort of like, in my case, and this is, my rule book of Bernard is like once you start having adding additional color to it, like we mix the color to see what it look like, you start to figure out where are other places that you can sort of add that. So I can take a little bit of this, move it over here, you know, see it. Maybe I'll bring this back here.
Does the painting have to be pretty dry for you to add Caran d'Ache to it, or can it be?
No, I mean it's you can work on it at any point really. Um, it will affect how the mark goes on, but let's say if you wanted to work on a wet area, it would. The one thing it won't do that you'll find happens with watercolor is watercolor wants to absorb into the paper and spread out. Whereas this, the mark sort of just stays in its place, which is still kind of cool because you can sort of, you know, like if you wanted to get hair, you sort of add like marks that look like hair with a little bit of a brush work, and even work in combination with the Caran d'Ache to sort of get so very painterly mark here. And then I'll bring this a little closer, you can see what it looks like. Yeah. All right, and I'll bring this a little closer so you can see what that mark looks like. See, this, so it's really hard to see. Yeah, you see that? So you can use sort of get different kinds of, get that, I'm sorry, a sort of painterly mark making thing, and you can sort of, by combining the wet area, the brush strokes,
Is Caran d'Ache similar to watercolor pencil, or different, and how are they alike?
It's it's similar to it's very much the same principle as watercolor pencil. Water soluble pencils are good, but with the caveat that you don't want to wet the tip of a watercolor pencil. Mostly because you don't want it to be you don't want that sort of really concentrated mark that you'll get if you have a wet tip. Like here, of course, I have everything here. Like all of this is like basically concentrated pigment. And if you start wetting it, it's gonna start. If you wet the tip while you're working, you're gonna have this like streak that you can't do anything with on the surface of your drawing or your painting. Unless that works for you and that's what you want, I would avoid sort of wetting the tip of a watercolor pencil and applying it directly to your drawing. You have to be kind of intentional with it. Generally speaking, what watercolor pencil is for, well, what it's widely used for, is like you might say find an area and you do some cross hatching, right? I'm just going to put this directly here, right? So you might do some cross hatching. Everybody knows this from drawing classes. Basically, layering your mark. Right, see that? Right. I'll bring this in here so you sort of see it. Basically overlapping your mark, right? And leaving it kind of like in this dry state. And then from there on, applying a wet brush to it to break that down. Whereas like the watercolor, the Caran d'Ache crayon is a little different. One, it's very it's softer, right? So the mark is more crayon like. So it's a little bit of a softer mark that you'll find that's made, and that can be that can be appealing. see. Let's see. We're going here.
So you can actually combine both of them for different aesthetic in one painting.
Right, right. Now, what it will do is if you do use it and you decide to go back into, like, say, the drawing part, it'll give you the control that we as, like, you can't really see it in that area. Let's say I'll go around the nose, right? I'll go around the nose, that area. It'll give you the control to sort of capture, areas like that you might want a nice, soft transition to it, and you want to have that control that you have in a that we all love in our drawing, like when we draw. Um, you can use it for shading. If you want to, you can use it for shading in certain areas too. You know, and then it's kind of soft. Like this is a hodgepodge of different kinds of marks. But once again, can soften that up, and then here. Yeah. And like everybody else, my thing is like I know as an artist, I go in and I'll go to the nuts. I'll just work and work and work and work and work an area. And this allows you to rework an area. So that's one of the good things about working with the Karen Dodge.
When you're doing a drawing with Caran d'Ache for the portrait, are you thinking about the proportions of the head, and is there suggestions you can give us about techniques for getting the right proportions in the portrait?
Well, it's kind of interesting because proportions, it's come up throughout I've been at Fleisher for like 10 years or so, teaching classes, and it always comes up because we're sort of taught that, you know, we could come up with this sort of measurement formula that always works. And it changes dramatically based on the position of the head, in that, like, for instance, her head is down on a slant and her ears are actually covered. But if her ears were shown, I would have to work at an angle that was perpendicular to her eyebrows and like say, her nose. Her jawline would also have to work that way. So the best thing is to just think about how things line up, as opposed to, like it's relative. It's like how does the nose relate? How does the ear relate to, say, the mouth? How does the nose relate to the ear? How does the eye relate to the ear? But also, how does the let's say the cheek relate to the shoulder? So my thing has always been to think about how things measure next to other things, like using the anatomy, but basically how do things line up? Hopefully that makes some sense, because it's a different way of sort of looking at it. Um, um, but it's very, very helpful to think of it that way. I mean, because what happens a lot in breaking out into what happens a lot in drawing classes and painting classes, is people try to fit the model or the pose into the formula that they think they should see. It's better, in my opinion, to really confront what's actually there. You know, Construction lines help. Construction lines being lines that you draw through the body. Like, you might draw a line that goes from one place to the next, or you might draw a line that goes from one side to the next, and that's fine. You can always paint them out or draw them out. But yeah, you should confront reality, and by just observing what you actually see, as opposed to, like, trying to think of a formula that will work in every occasion. Um, does that make sense? Hopefully it makes sense. Makes sense to me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Once again, this cross hatching thing is so useful when dealing with a large area.
So I have another question for you about your technique. Once the water dries, does the pigment soak into the UPO paper or will it always sit right on top?
It
Is
will
it
always,
necessary to somehow fix the painting on UPO paper so it doesn't smudge?
well, you could spray it with like a fixative when you're done. You could spray it with a fixative when you're done to sort of like make it sort of hold. I mean, that would be something that you can do. Um, Generally speaking, if you're using it, it's best to protect it. Like once you're done with painting, and if you have something that you really want to keep and you want to have longevity, one thing that you want to do is put it behind glass or plexiglass. Um, that way you'll be able to to ensure that nobody's fingers are going to smudge or it's not going to be affected by the elements and stuff like that. That's the best way to protect it. In the meantime, while it's open, because I consider it, you know, it's sort of open for experimentation, open for work, you know, um, have at it. Just keep working on it, you know. And once you got it locked in and you feel like this is that piece, it's the piece is ready for the big show, the big exhibit, um, is ready to be, or you feel like you want to sort of gift it. I mean, that's something else you might want to do, gift it to someone. Once you get it to that point, then start thinking about how you can sort of make it, give it uh, that permanence.
Do you use a white caran for highlights or just use the white of the paper?
It's funny. Um, I've used, it can go either way. I mean, you can use the white of the paper for highlights, the ultimate highlights, you know. But if you want to get colors that is somewhere in between, you can still mix white with your color to do that on top too. But mostly, like if you really want a very sharp highlight, like there's a very sharp highlight that we see in her forehead, about like say right here, all I would have to do is darken either side and leave that the white of the paper. Let me see if I can get a little bit more brown here. And let that speak for itself. Um,
And I
it's
see
one of the,
you're doing a technique where you're like taking your brush and um, dipping it into other areas and then putting it onto a new area instead of like just even adding any carandash. Is that something
right,
that you're doing?
definitely. Because there's so much pigment that's on here that you can play with. You can just sort of move that around and not feel like you have to always apply more paint directly to the surface. It's much easier to sort of do that, and you know, it's just kind of interesting. Just an interesting thing that I've started to do. I think it also had to deal with like uh, one of the first things that I was told when I was an undergraduate in painting was that people put on way too much paint. My original paintings when I first started art school, they used to weigh like 50 pounds, just paint over paint over paint over paint, and they still were ugly. They were some of the ugliest things I've ever created. So that stuck with me. So I said, you know what? Where I can, where I can, um, I preserve the paint that I have, and I sort of try and use it to its fullest. So that's sort of where it is. It's part me being cheap, and then me just trying to sort of like get the most bang for my buck. The other thing too is like, let's say you're in a situation where you don't have a ton of paint. You just don't. Like you're at the beach or you're at the park, and you know, you know, it's in your best interest to figure out how to use your paint and get the most out of it. because you might not be near an art store or something like that. Or, the stores might be closed as they are right now. Makes sense?
Yeah, definitely.
And I'm just going to go a little bit more into this. And I want to shift over here to the, I think it would be good to shift over to the other painting.
Sure. Maybe while we still have you on this painting, are there any compositional elements that you had in mind or would recommend for the style of portraiture for setting a portrait into a canvas?
Like if I was to set this into a canvas.
Well, like composing this image, were there anything that you were paying attention to, like that the portrait is centered, or that
Oh
the
yeah,
face
absolutely.
is,
Well,
like in the third portion of the painting? Like, what are your thoughts on composition and portraiture?
well, I think it's basically if you think about there are people who've written extensively about how you set up your subject in a painting. When I think about the portrait, I think like how do you want that portrait to sort of engage the viewer? Where do you want their eye to zoom in? Like you have your phone, and your phone basically has like a zoom function to it. So because your phone does this, you focus in on that area and you draw to it. Like because I drew Antoinette's head in such a way that it was large enough that I could sort of get into the details. It allowed me to make bigger brush strokes, to be a little freer with the brush strokes, and to really play around. So so part of it is like creating a pleasurable experience for the worker or the painter, like creating the image. Like if if I make her head, if I made her like very small in the picture plane, then it makes a contract that I have to deal with all of this area right here because it becomes that much more important. But because I zoomed in on Antoinette's face and really like made that the focus of attention, it allowed me to get into her hair and get into this. Her head sort of has that tilt, and I can sort of reflect that. She has some wonderful texture in her hair. Her hair is sort of in micro braids, so her hair is like this very like sort of textural thing going on with her hair, and I could play with those elements. So whereas like when you have something that's very very small, it becomes about the surrounding environment around that paint, around that image. So that's with anything, even if it's abstract or if you're doing multiple figures. Um, sort of thinking about where you want the viewer to focus their attention. This is where I want you to look. So look at here, look at this. It's bigger than the other things, or it's brighter than the other things. It might be more colorful than the other things. Sometimes you can sort of play around with color in the same way. You know, this being a little small monochromatic thing, of course, because I'm obsessive, I'm going to play with this a little bit more. You got a little drip, you got a little wait for it. There you go. Watch for drips. Watch for drips.
What
So
happens if there's a drip? What do you do?
you take yourself towel and you just sort of dab it. You dab where it collects most. Like it collected most. Like the water will have like a drip, and the drip will be it's pulling all the other color downward. So then you just hit it with a little bit of a paper towel, and that'll soak up some of that. You know, like a totally different issue than say if you're working with paper. This paper is going to soak some of that up. This won't. It'll just roll off of it until it gets to a point where then it'll soak up a little teeny bit, but it'll still be on the surface. Does that make sense?
Bernard, yeah, that makes total sense. Thank you. What colors do you recommend for a limited palette? If you're working with a limited palette for a portrait, what colors do you recommend?
Um, like yellow ochre, yellow ochre, like raw umber, um, warm earth tone colors are really great. And they're very, it's a traditional thing, like yellow ochre, raw umber, burnt umber as you go darker. Then have like maybe say um, a nice like a phthalo green that you could sort of mix in with that umber to sort of darken it a little bit, cool it off a little bit. Um, but those are the kind of colors, like earth tone colors that because one traditionally they've been used for underpainting um, because they're the kind of colors that you can make blend into other colors. If you go say with like a day glow red or orange or these sort of like crazy blue, I don't know. If you go with like crazy blues, I mean you can do it, but you're going to get more of a psychedelic, weird kind of feel, and that could be great. You might want to be weird. I am not against weird. Weird is awesome. I've been weird before. I'm weird right now. Um, but uh, but if you want to keep it, like I tend to keep it some semi-transparent, earth tone kind of colors that you can sort of push a little further. They give me a little bit of a start, but they're not overly dominant. You know,
Hmm.
they give me a little bit more of a feeling of control. You know, so let's say that. Now bring this. I wanted to bring this up. Can I bring the other one now?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So earlier today, I was working with Rocky Sylvester Stallone, Rocky Balboa. Um, and, it's kind of an interesting kind of process working with that. It's just kind of interesting to see, and I'm gonna take Antoinette down. I will work on Antoinette some more. So what I'll do is the paint with Karen Doss, the parts you try to paint in. What was that question?
What happens if when painting with Caran d'Ache crayons, there's parts you try to paint in where crayon marks are left?
Well, I mean, you could either soften them. You can, if you want to, you can sort of soften them, wet those crayon marks with the brush, and sort of like soften them just with like a little bit of a brush stroke. If you want to take them completely off, you can always take, you know, paper towel and just sort of with a wet paper towel, and I'll just sort of like take this off just a little bit in this corner. See that? I'll show you. I'll bring it back later on, but if you want to get rid of a part, see at the top of her head.
That's pretty incredible how easily that happens.
Yeah, it's like you could make it. It's like you can make it like it never happened. You know, you could put it back. You know.
And do you sometimes leave a mixture of like a Caran d'Ache mark and the watercolor effect that you get from wetting
Oh,
it? Because it looks like her lips and the edges of her nose are still like with as a Caran d'Ache mark.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Try this up here. Like sometimes like I'll go on once again only because this is Karen Dodge. I'll get over here, like here. Like say go right here. Uh, so I could soften all that if I want to, and sort of make sort of these marks sort of like uh, disappear. Here, like inside her lips, if I wanted to, I could sort of go like here and just make it a value as opposed to like having just the marks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So is it actually? I mean, it's an incredible. It's very interesting how this stuff works because it works so much differently than say like traditionally sort of working on paper. Um, and that's fine. It's just like a whole different kind of process of working. You have to get used to it, and it can be frustrating initially because things do come and things go. Things come and go. You know, it's very very sensitive kind of deal. You know,
Can you
I
talk?
want to go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, you go ahead.
No, like I want to show you something else here. We all know this technique. For those who haven't worked with watercolors in the past, I'm gonna go here, working on this. Since I have a an earlier drawing of this sort of Rocky Balboa thing, um, which I like. I like Sylvester Stallone. Go. Like one thing that you can do with watercolor paper that you can't do with UPO is work wet into wet and have things sort of blend. Let me give an example of that. Rush this in 1 second. It's like an aerobic exercise here. All right. So let's say you want to do background color. One thing that you can do with paper that you can't do with Caran d'Ache is wet your area. I got it taped around its edges. You can sort of see the tape around the edges. I'm going to have so many pictures of Rocky when I'm done. It's going to be crazy, Vita. Rocky pictures for
You make a
sale.
collage. Just
Yeah.
an homage collage.
Well, we're doing fabulous, but the whole theme was off to a rocky start. But we're doing fabulous. All right. So I'm gonna take Antoinette and I'm gonna put it to the side for just a second. I'll put it behind this one here. I have my Sennelier fancy schmancy watercolor set. Blah blah blah. And this paper is sort of wet now because I wet all around the background, all around the head. So I can, just by adding some water to it, get these really soft and pretty effects. And when you're thinking about Rocky Balboa, you think pretty. So I want to get some nice blue over here around this head. And notice how you get this like cloud-like softness to the mark. You see that? What's happening is that water is breaking down this pigment and dragging it along the edge of where you sort of wet. See that? Where it's wet. So you get this nice soft mark. Something that doesn't happen on UPO paper. So this gives a chance to sort of see contrast. And if you wanted to, let's say we wanted to work with Caran d'Ache on that wet area, so you can see what it looks like when you're working in Caran d'Ache on a wet area. You'll get, it'll break it down too. See that? Break it down a little bit too. Give me 1 second. Let me just sort of wet this corner up. But you have to be somewhat cautious because if you do that, you'll also get, see the marks. Something that doesn't happen with UPO paper is you'll still have those marks left on the paper itself from where you drew on it, which is okay. But I mean, you just have to factor it into what you're painting. And I'll just finish this background here real quick because I'm doing it really quickly. Go back to the, you see? See, I can get a nice blended skylight. Now Rocky's outside. See that?
Mm-hmm.
If I wanted to, I could put clouds in it. Let me see. You wanted to? See that?
Yep.
Rocky's at the beach. Happy little cloud. That's right. Happy little clouds. Yeah. And I'm definitely tapping into my inner Bob Ross right now. Yes, indeed. Now I couldn't put the, it's actually kind of comical when you put the clouds in. It looks kind of funny. So, so going back to the, I'll go back to the one we did earlier, a different approach, but very similar technical approach to add in some of the cools and warm colors in here um, into the composition. You know, a combination of warm and cool colors to sort of help make this face go, face sort of form. Um, but like you could go a different direction. Let's say um, you don't necessarily have to stick with the traditional sort of color palette with it, and I know this is going to seem kind of crazy. You can definitely go a little bit nuts and say go with a whole different color theme. Like let's say instead of going with like a traditional palette, you decide you're gonna go with like you just want to do like cool colors. I'm gonna make it cool, like an ice cold Sylvester Stallone. You definitely can go with cool colors. Cool colors meaning like greens, blues, in that sort of part of the color spectrum. And you'll have a whole different kind of effect. Sometimes what I'll do, if you don't mind my sharing it with you, is I'll actually go with like a different kind of color palette. And then once I'm to the end of the sort of session, then I'll go at it with a more traditional palette on top. I'll start blending like natural colors on these unnatural colors just to see what happens. Only because I'm a rebel, I'm a renegade. I want to see what it looks like. So I'm gonna add some of these cool colors in here. We're gonna play around here with this. If you don't mind. I'm sort of and please forgive me. I could do this. I could do this for hours at a time. This is like what it's about for me. So
Yeah, we only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to open it up for questions. If anyone still has any questions for Bernard, feel free to type them into the chat box. We have just a couple more minutes left here tonight. So in this process that you're doing, are you painting in the shadows first?
well, yeah. Well, in this instance, yeah, I'm painting in the shadows, but I also have mapped out some of the light areas, the highlighted areas, um, because watercolors, generally speaking, it's harder to get them back. It's hard to get watercolors back to white once you cover an area. So what you do is you'll either block it out with like a masking fluid, which I haven't done in either painting. These are just sort of like, just going for it. Um, or if you paint around those light areas and paint those in last. So
you would generally start from the shadows. And the masking fluid, can you remove it afterwards, or does it just stay?
oh, it's awesome. Masking fluid is it comes in either a jar, like now they have it so it comes. I don't have any around me now, but it comes in a, yes I do. 1 second, I'll show you some masking fluid. I'm giving you all the secrets. This is it. This is a good brand. This is backwards on me, but it says Molotov, and it basically you would apply it on this tip on the highlighted areas, then you would paint over it like it doesn't exist. And the cool thing about this is the color is because it's blue, you can sort of see the contrast with what you're painting. It used to be more like a flesh color kind of mark it would leave. so you could like it would be almost hard to find where you left the mark. And then you erase it out when you're done. You erase it out after a couple minutes, and then it's like
What do you erase it with?
you erase it with you erase it with like either you use any kind of erasing surface, any kind of eraser, um, or you can use like the kneadable erasers.
Oh,
Just sort of like
really?
yeah, anything that'll pull at the rubber and like sort of like get you back to that white of the page. Be careful, be cautious while using it, because if you erase too hard, or if you sort of like if you use like a very if you use a very cheap grade of paper, it sometimes can tear at the paper. Like it'll not only take off it won't just roll off the paper. It'll take off a little bit of the paper underneath, you know. But usually that's not a problem. So,
Bernard, do you use these materials in your Fleisher classes? Do you teach
oh yeah,
with these materials?
yeah. I teach with the materials. Usually I'll bring in. We'll have our base of like the materials that we suggest, and I always say suggest because I know a lot of us have taken a lot of art classes in the past. But yeah, I use the same materials. I'll use the same materials to. Yep.
All
Oh,
right.
you're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, so I'll use these materials, the same materials that I'll talk to. If it's not in our list, I usually bring some of the materials with me to class, and I'll do a demonstration so you can actually see how the stuff works. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and
Great.
you know, I'll have some material. You know, every now and then I'll bring in some written material on stuff, but you know, I don't want it to be like a drag. You know, we just do a lot of painting when we get to class. We have fun. We go in it.
Yeah, and we paint from live models a lot. Do folks paint from photographs in your class too?
Mostly we paint from live models. We mostly paint from live models. But what I do, the way I run critiques, is I make the critiques a part of the class, um, not just like an afterthought. So at the end of the day, if you say you decided you wanted to draw a picture of Rocky Balboa, or you wanted to do a picture of your relatives, or a picture of a trip, you can bring that in, and then we'll talk about it while like in those in between times, the break times when we're not working from the live model. Um, Working at Fleischer, painting the live model is important because you get to see how a figure looks in real space, in real time. Of course, right now we're sort of delving into like, you know, other elements of drawing and painting, which are equally as valid. But that opportunity to work with a live model is a precious thing that we sort of think is important to your whole process. So yes,
Wonderful.
we critique paintings made from photographs. I critique paintings made from photographs. You know, some people are pure; they wouldn't do it. Some people are like, "Ah, you don't work from photographs." But then I'm like, well, you know, send some models over to sit at somebody's house for 6 and 7 hours and see if that works. You know,
Gotcha.
we pick up.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Bernard. This was so much fun. It was really great to see you work, and the portrait that you made is so beautiful. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us here tonight. It's really great to see so many familiar faces. Thanks so much. We hope that you join us again this week. We have a studio visit coming up with uh, Bill Brookover. We're going to be visiting his printmaking studio at his house tomorrow night at 6:30. And then we have an abstract painting demo with Mustafa Darwish that's coming up on Thursday. So we hope to see some of you there. Otherwise, have a great evening. Thanks again, Bernard, and take care. Good night, everyone.
All right, have a good one. All right, appreciate
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, come on down to Fleisher. Look forward to seeing your work.
Thank you.
All right. Goodbye.